black pupils within the universities. Because universities in America were stratified, right? Black universities and white universities. Black universities had to open up their own separate universities, and they were not allowed to be integrated within, where black people were not allowed to be integrated in white, so-called white universities. This was very, very common, right up until the end of the 1960s. Okay? So let's have a look at Malcolm, and let's have a look at his life. Okay? So Malcolm was born in Nebraska. His father was a preacher. Now this is very important, because you'll find that most of the leaders that came out of America, they came from fathers who were devout religious preachers, whether they were Methodist preachers, Baptist preachers, whatever the case may be. Okay? And if you look at the history of America, or even the Caribbean islands, you'll find that most of the instigators for change were preachers themselves. Okay? So religion wasn't seen as a hindrance in order for social change to take place. Okay? It was actually seen as a mechanism for change. Okay? Before the killing of his father in 1931, so Malcolm was approximately 6 years old when that actually took place. He experienced 2 arsons. Okay? So, before he was 6, they got burnt out of the house on 2 separate occasions. One in Nebraska and one in Michigan. Now, I got there, Sundown Towns. Now, Sundown Towns, there was a book which was written about, must have been about 7 or 8 years ago, called Sundown Towns. And because America was stratified, what sundown towns were that if dark-skinned people were seen in any particular region after 6 o'clock, they would be killed, they'd be lynched, their homes would be burnt. This is what used to take place. Sometimes the houses were forcibly confiscated off them by other white people within those regions. This is the sort of climate that he was under, and sundown towns still existed right through into the 1970s. We even see elements of lynching that took place within the American society, okay, where particular parts of black males' anatomy was either stored in the basement or in the attic of people's houses. And even today, there are grandchildren, great-grandchildren of a lot of these people who were lynching black people back in the 30s and 40s, who were finding these body parts, which were either in attics or basements. Sometimes they'd be put into shop windows. Burnt bodies would take, where professional photographers returned up to lynchings, because lynchings would be advertised in the newspaper. This is to show you the type of society that Malcolm was involved in, where the federal government refused to intervene in the oppression of a particular type of people. And there was people from different religious factions trying to bring about change. Okay, so Malcolm came from, so we talked about the sundown towns. Malcolm came from a well-educated family. Malcolm's mother and father, Louise and Earl Little, they were part of a movement called the UNIA, which was organized by Marcus Garvey, who was originally from Jamaica, and it was the largest black organization of the 20th century, between 6 to 9 million people globally. There was more chapters in places like Costa Rica and Cuba than any other place in the world. So what I'm trying to show here that how the movement became more internationalized in a sense, where Malcolm X's parents were heavily involved. His mother was a well-educated woman. Even Malcolm, if you read his autobiography, one of the things that he even said, the element of jealousy that his father had towards his mother's erudition. She was a well-educated woman. Okay? So there was no mucking around at all. And the other thing I want to emphasize as well about Malcolm's family was that they had a love for how they looked, which was very rare in the 1930s and 1940s. How do you bring up a child in a very hostile environment to like themselves, to love themselves? This is the sort of hostile environment that you grew up with. But he was able to bypass that to a large extent because of the constant education that he had coming from the home from both his parents. Okay? So Malcolm, like I said, he did really well in school. He wanted to become a lawyer. And when he expressed himself to his teacher that he wanted to become a lawyer, his teacher told him that he was going a bit too far with that. To be a dark-skinned person, a black person who wanted to become a lawyer was not being realistic. It was better for him to be maybe a plumber, a carpenter, something like that, of menial or manual work. This is what came out of the discussion, okay? And this was when things started to change for Malcolm himself, when he started to have a disbelief or lack of faith within the educational system. An element of lack of faith amongst certain white people. And then he started to rebel as he started getting older. This is a picture, an image of Malcolm X's parents. Okay? Now Malcolm was known as, when he became a gangster, Malcolm was known as Detroit Red. And the reason why is because he had ginger hair. Okay? His grandfather was actually Irish. And if we look at his autobiography, he talks about his mother. His mother was a product of rape, okay? His grandmother got raped, and obviously she was a product of that. And there was a saying that Malcolm said, that one of the things that she wanted to ensure when she married, she wanted to marry someone as dark as possible to wash away that disgust or that shame of who she was, okay? So even Malcolm's roots as an unstable type of equilibrium, if you want. As well, what I think is important to mention as well was that Earl was considered one of those controversial figures. They would move into particular areas where they weren't wanted or where they were disliked, and he would literally fight against the type of opposition that he was receiving from the people. This is why they were burnt out many, many times. There was even court cases where they actually purchased homes in particular places, and those homes were taken off them because those homes could not be owned by so-called coloured people. So this was the type of environment that Malcolm himself found himself in. Okay, this is just Marcus Garvey. Now, these are the sort of things that established itself in the early 1920s. Now, Marcus Garvey at the time, he was in Britain, he was in America, he was in the Caribbean islands, was trying to bring about international change. There was only 2 countries in Africa which were independent at this particular time. It was Liberia and Ethiopia. Every other country in Africa was under European hegemony or colonization. And Marcus Garvey wanted to involve the African nations in trade. This is what he wanted to do. Okay? In 1921, when Marcus Garvey went to the Americas around about 1917, 1918, he used to pack up holes, etc. He had particular slogans. He wanted to see some major international changes take place for his people globally. And some of the things that came out of Malcolm X's teaching and Malcolm X's experience, the element of self-reliance. The movement was self-reliant, which meant they had no external bodies supporting or financing their movement. The Marcus Garvey, they talked about independence. They wanted to see independence for all African countries, irrespective of their religious affiliation. Black is beautiful was one of the slogans, was one of the major slogans that was said at this time. And he had a magazine as well. And one of the things I like to say about the magazine, it was the only black magazine in the Western world which did not allow bleaching creams and hair straighteners to be advertised or publicized within their material. So it was a case of trying to love and to acknowledge who you are as a person. This was the growth of the movement. And this movement stretched to almost 9 million, okay, globally. This is how much it stretched in such a short space of time. In 1921, we see the rise of the Council of Foreign Relations. The Council of Foreign Relations, which President Obama is a member of, was created first and foremost to destroy the Garvey movement. They wanted to stop international trade between Africa, and their so-called cousins in the Western world. This is what the CFR was established for. okay, in order to destroy the movement. Marcus Garvey was later deported. Yeah, he actually went back to Jamaica, element of disgrace, but the elements of his philosophy still existed at this particular time. We know that a member of his movement at this particular time, in the 1920s, was a person by the name of Elijah Poole, who became later known as Elijah Muhammad. Okay, he was a member of the UNIA. Okay, there was loads of members. Even the family of Martin Luther King, etc., was part of this movement. Okay, so you can see that the element of international trade, self-reliance, independence, these were sort of slogans that African Americans at this time, or black people globally, wanted to bring about. They wanted to bring about these changes. Right, some of the things that affected black people in America, like I said, was poor housing, bad schooling, low education attainment, which still exists today, the rise of matrifocal homes, single-parent households, because the amount of black males which were being incarcerated on trumped-up charges. These were regular things that were taking place within many of the inner cities within America. Increased prison sentences, high unemployment was really, really common at the same time. And what America was doing at this time was opening up its floodgates to European immigration to take over those jobs, so many of those darker-skinned people could not gain employment, because this is one way of trying to destroy them. And Malcolm saw this being systemic. He started to see it being systematic. It was well planned. And these were the sort of things that he himself was speaking out against. Right, let's have a look at it now. So, we all know, most of you, if you've seen the film of Malcolm X, will know that he was a gangster, or so-called gangster. We know that he was a pimp. We know he used to sell women. He said he sold black women, white women, to whoever he can do. He didn't care who, what he did. He was on all sorts of intoxicants, and he wasn't just selling these intoxicants, he was using these intoxicants as well. Okay? So this is the sort of life that he ended up going into. Now, the reason why he was incarcerated for 8 to 10 years was because of theft. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was because him and his friend were supposed to have broken into a house, and they both had so-called white girlfriends. And when those two white girls turned up to court, because of the so-called miscegenation laws that was prevalent within many of the states, miscegenation laws means they outlawed race mixing through marriage. This is what it was. A majority of the states were like this at this particular time, especially in the 50s and the 60s. Okay? What started taking place at this point was that the court system wanted to make an example, not just to these two white girls, but also to these two blacks. Okay? And that's why their sentence, was so high at this particular time. So Malcolm ended up going to prison for 8 to 10 years. I think he only spent about 8 and a little bit of years within the prison system itself. While he was there, he talked about, and if you read his autobiography, because his autobiography is something I think we should all read, okay? It's really good. It's an A to Z of his life, okay? The person that he wrote who helped him write his autobiography, his name was Alex Haley. Those of you may know the film, the drama that came out a few years ago, well, back in the 1970s actually, but since another drama came out a couple months ago called Roots, okay? It was actually through speaking to Malcolm X, compiling the work, compiling his autobiography, that it was that particular point of time that Alex Haley decided to look at his own family tree, his own roots, okay? And then he actually found out that he had Muslim families that went back to Gambia, okay? So this is the sort of type of people that Malcolm X himself was dealing with. He was speaking to different types of political leaders. He actually personally knew Fidel Castro, because Fidel Castro did come to America at one time, and he did not want to come to America unless he knew that Malcolm X was going to be part of his security. He said if Malcolm X would be part of security, he knew he'd be safe if he came to America. This was just after the so-called Cuban Revolution. So we start to see the type of people that Malcolm X himself is mixing with at this particular point. But when he's in prison at this particular time, he is astonished with this one particular person by the name of Bimbi, who he talks about being a walking encyclopedia, where literally that every time a question, any sort of subject that can be spoken about, Bimbi knew something about it. And Malcolm wanted to be this person. This is what inspired him to become who he became, okay? He knew political science, sociology, psychology, anthropology. He knew all these things, theology, and he was taken back by this person. Then he decided that what he would end up doing in order to become more eloquent in his speech, because he was a jiver, he knew how to talk, he knew how to jive, okay? How can he use this in order to become an empowering speaker in years to come? So Malcolm was beginning to transform himself while he was in prison, because they say a prison system is not necessarily for rehabilitation, but Malcolm X himself was being rehabilitated. But it was only through self-discovery, self-inquiry. This is what brought about this change for Malcolm X himself. So he had memorized the entire dictionary. He learned how to spell every single word in the dictionary, understood its meaning, its root words, etc. This is why in the 1950s and 60s, when he started speaking, people were quite surprised, especially from the dominant culture, how eloquent this person was, and that he actually received his education in a prison system. They were absolutely shocked that this is actually what happened. But this is what Malcolm himself was engaged in. Okay, he was going through this element of transformation. Okay, he taught himself how to write. Now, while he was in there, he met up with a few people who were part of the Nation of Islam at this particular time. Yeah, but the people he was more in close contact with was his family members. A couple of his brothers and his sister had embraced the Nation of Islam. Now, let me just give you a thing about the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam started approximately in 1931. Okay, so it was round about the time of the Depression. Okay, within America. Okay, W. Farad Muhammad, who's supposed to be the founder, he was basically, I think he was a silk peddler. He would go from certain place to sell his silk. Now, he was from the Indo-Pakistan region. This is where he originally came from. Okay, this is where his people, his family originally came from before he went there. Now, one of the things that he experienced, because he was white, W. Farad Muhammad, but he was still seen as being brown. All he basically did was use the Varna system or the caste system and turn it upside down. That's all which he did, okay? He turned the Varna system, or what you call as the caste system, upside down. So